Let's welcome Paolo here, an artist and game designer. And his presentation is on the screen. Yes.
All right.
Hi, Paolo.
All right, thank you for having me. So my name is Paolo, I'm from Italy. I teach game design at Carnegie Mellon University in the United States. I make games as Molleindustria, so it's a project of reappropriation of video game. I make satirical games, political games, and kind of experimental games. For example, like the most recent digital project is a VR piece called A Short History of the Gays. It's an experiential essay about the relationship between gays and violence. So it goes from the evolution of sight to the panopticon and the military gaze. And you interact basically by looking and not looking at things in a sequence of conceptually related but loosely related scenarios. Another release, quote unquote, is this non-digital project that is called Casual Games for Protesters, and it's made in collaboration with a poet and an activist and artist called Harry Giles. And it's a collection of games to be played in the context of marches, rallies, occupations, and other protests. So the idea is to make demonstrations less boring and more accessible. But today, since it's a business conference, I'm going to talk about business, not about my stuff. And I want to talk about the indie-apocalypse and attention economy and cultural overproduction, which is really part of a dilemma that all cultural producers are facing now, I think. So in the last couple of years, people have been talking about indie-apocalypse in relation to a series of pointers, such as the seemingly exponential increase in the number of game releases, and the decreasing sales and revenues that come with that, even when adjusted by supposed quality. And also the disappointing commercial reception of critically acclaimed multi-year projects. So I think in the apocalypse, or like this kind of saturation is a good problem to have, because we fought for this. Like we fought for open platforms, for accessible tools. We advocated for more experimentation, and the kind of experimentation that big companies cannot afford to have. So we fought to increase the diversity of voices in game making. But when we democratize the means of production and distribution, we should expect a proliferation of cultural producers and cultural products. So nobody really in the indie circles predicts the disappearance of independent development, so it's not going to be an apocalypse. But everybody seems to agree that the independent game market is getting more saturated compared to the early years of, say, like 2006, 2012, which is the scenario depicted in Indie Game, the movie, right? Now it's just harder to make a living or even to get people to play your free games, and you have to invest more and more money into acquiring players and so on. So it's not an apocalypse, but more of a recession, more like a bubble or a boom and bust cycle. And in economic terms, might be more similar to an overproduction crisis. Like overproduction, according to Marx, is one of the inherent contradiction of capitalism. So it's the cause of many crises like the Great Depression and so on. So you have overproduction when more commodities are produced than can be profitably sold for a profit. So there's too much investment, too many people trying to capture a share of the market. And overproduction crises are not new in games. When Pong became a fad, the market was flooded with Pong clones, right? Like in 1977, there were about 500 consoles that were like Pong consoles, and the market crashed. Atari survived just because of Space Invaders, and it didn't last long. A couple of years later, in 1983, as you might know, there was the second crash of the video game industry in North America, and one of the main causes was the overproduction of software, overproduction of games, where there were like clones and sequels and bad licensed games like the infamous E.T. So, of course, a crisis is a complex relationship between offer, demand, and prices. But I think we know one thing for sure, which is that when the content is abundant, when the games are abundant, the content becomes cheap, and the scarce resource becomes time. Our capacity for consumption doesn't extend indefinitely, right? We have a limited cognitive capacity to process culture. We have a limited free time to absorb time-based media. And for free time, at least in the United States, didn't change much in the last 15 years. It's kind of like stayed flat. And moreover, this leisure time is contended by many industries. Game makers are not only competing with each other, but they are competing with TV and social media and social activities. So some of the best minds of our generation are there in the Silicon Valley, working on systems to increase dependency and procrastination on their platforms, right? And this is what is generally referred as the attention economy, but it's more like attention warfare. A war to capture every fragment of time, to capture eyeballs, to produce stories that hook you up for the longest time, and so on. In the industry, you often hear this, that this is just how things are today. You have to just get better and smarter at making games or at promoting games. You have to get smarter at acquiring players and so on. And everybody has a chance to be famous for like 15 minutes, or like they might sell, so many will sell maybe like 15 copies and disappear. And I kind of have issues with this Darwinistic view, because it's likely to penalize developers with less means and less privilege, people who cannot risk hundreds of thousands of dollars for a game project or invest years in polishing and marketing a product. So those who don't have the education, the social capital, the connection needed to succeed because they cannot afford, for example, like a conference ticket, or because they don't live in North America or Northern Europe, or so on. So the second problem is that this scenario gives immense power to filters and gatekeepers. App Store, Steam, those are like platforms that get to profit from this saturation because they make money anyway, right? And they get to determine what's successful by curating and featuring and so on. So I'm not super happy about that. And I would like to propose a series of ways to, not solution between quotes, ways to address the problem of cultural overproduction. They are not solutions, but ways to shift the framing of this dilemma and introduce perhaps new dimension. And they are an invite to rethink how, why, and for whom we make games. So the first approach, increase the leisure time. So it might seem absurd in a country where like youth unemployment is like 50%, right? But I think we can rephrase it as a rebalancing of work time. So capitalism always produces masses of overworked people and masses of underemployed or unemployed. And in our microcosm, this translates to masses who don't have money to buy games and masses who don't have time to play games, just to simplify, obviously. So I think the vision, the political vision for our game developers is to, make people like redistribute this work, this scarce work, and work less and employ everybody. And in all capitalist economies, work time decreases as productivity increases, like in this dynamic graph. So we should like encourage the kind of like an increase in productivity, like automation and robots, and try to redistribute the benefits of these. So in the graph here, you can see that there is a lot of potential time to liberate in developing countries. And that takes me to the next approach, new markets. So like historically, dominant countries looked for new markets to absorb their surplus of production and also to extract natural resources. That's kind of how capitalism expanded to encompass the whole world, right? And this has often been done aggressively or through kind of like aggressively imposing free trade agreements or like the expansion of the European Union and so on. But maybe there is also like a more gentle, perhaps less imperialist approach to the pursuit of new gamers, which is collaborating with developers in emerging countries. Like instead of treating India or the Middle East as a country to outsource production and to market our own very Western games, we can establish partnership and exchanges beyond just like the mere localization. Here you see like this is an old video, but you see Middle Eastern kids playing American games in which they have to shoot Middle Eastern people, right? And it's kind of like a little bit fucked up because they are sort of like playing with our own propaganda. That's not quite right. I think we can learn what makes a game not only successful but meaningful in another country and exchange know-how and resources. And I think indies can do well in non-Western markets because in emerging economies the hardware is a limit. And AAA companies are sort of like forced to chase the latest generation, latest generation hardware to please Western consumers. But small indie games can be more effectively targeting slower or less connected machines. So, other solution, expanding play. So I don't know if you see the image here. It's just some dude playing games while having sex, and the idea of playing video games while having sex is kind of ridiculous, right? But I think it's mostly because it's ergonomically awkward. Like, there are no games nor game machines specifically conceived for that gaming situation. If you can come up with games that can be played while having sex, you might create a new niche, a new genre, or maybe a new industry. And this is just to say that the history of video games is a history of conquest. It's a conquest of new spaces, new places in our everyday life. Games are born in kind of closed laboratories. They are made and played. They were made and played almost in secret, right? They were like, that's what computers were meant to be, right? And then they sort of like moved to penny arcades, to arcades and amusement parks, and they were sort of like capturing and conquering time that it was previously devoted to mechanical entertainment, right? And then game consoles interface with TV screens, right? And in doing so, they penetrated a crucial battlefield for the attention economy, which is the living room. That's where a lot of media is consumed. So home and personal computer, just shortly afterwards, are started to get marketed as more than video games, and they conquer the studio, the bedroom, the desk. And that's when work time and play time start to become intertwined. But it's only with the popularity of handheld devices, say like Game Boy, but smartphones later, that the possibility of playing literally anywhere and anytime becomes real. And according to these ads, you can play with the Game Boy while traveling, you can play in private, you can play while on a romantic date and after sex. And the issue of context is what the industry, the VR industry, can't quite figure out. Like, where does VR live? Like, where is it acceptable to be sort of blindfolded and vulnerable? And how many people have access to a room that can be turned into a VR playground? For example, in other words, we have to ask ourselves, what are the spaces and situations that can be still conquered by play? So Americans spend 290 hours a year driving, right? And a lot of this partial attention while you're driving is occupied by radio and podcasts. Podcasts are very popular in the United States, perhaps also because of that, because of commuting time. But it's likely that self-driving cars, by freeing the driver's hands, will become essentially, turn cars into mobile hubs for general digital consumption, including games. And that's why there is a lot of interest among companies in self-driving cars, I think. The ultimate frontier to conquer for capitalism is sleep. Like, we spend 1/3 of our time sleeping, and when we sleep, we cannot consume or produce, right? So can play get there? Can play conquer the frontier of sleep? Because, there are smart devices that are already starting to move into the bedroom and extract value from sleep and extract data by monitoring and optimizing sleep cycle. Because obviously you're stressed out and capitalism always provides the solution to the problems it creates. So it is not, I think, a big leap to think, can we make games that can be played while sleeping? Can we make games that affect dreams? And I think perhaps games are already sort of expanding in that way. Social games like Farmville were born in symbiosis with social media and introduced a kind of background kind of play in which game time blends with lifetime. Like power player or addicts in Farmville had to sort of like schedule their days according to the crop scheduling in Farmville. So in some extent, they are always playing even when they are sleeping. And I think, like, how can games fragment and fractalize our everyday life even further in order to extract more time from a limited attention is a pretty interesting question. Like idle games that you play in another browser window, or games like Cookie Clicker or Neko Hatsune that you're sort of like playing but just checking every so often, or pervasive games like Pokemon Go that can sort of like intertwine with your routines and your movement in space. They just add a layer of play that doesn't require constant full attention. To me, they're all like symptoms and way to deal with the scarcity of attention. So the obvious antagonist of play is work, right? And as we know, games find their way into the workplace. Like people like working in office can occasionally play games, right? So this project I'm showing, I don't know if you can see it. It looks like an Excel, but it's actually a game. It's called Can't You See I'm Busy? And it's a collection of games that are meant to be secretly played at work. And like it looks like a spreadsheet. They look like ordinary application like Word or Excel, but you can actually play like little arcade games. And so your boss doesn't notice them and so on. And it's a satirical project, obviously, that aspires like supposedly to steal paid hours from corporation and so on. But to me, it's also an interesting proposition. How do you design games that can be safely and effectively played while working? Like, how do you take that time? So, other solution, new gamers, new kinds of gamers. So in the United States, about 40% of people play games for at least 3 hours a week. It's a lot, right? But also not. So we can flip the problem and say that it's not a saturation issue. We just make games that 60% of people don't want to play, just like overall. And I don't have data on this, but like as an anecdote, when you're young, you generally have more time to spend, more free time, and less money to spend on games. And this relationship sort of inverts as you get old, as you age. Like you start working or having a family, and sort of like purchasing games might not be a big problem. But finding like 6 hours to play Final Fantasy gets increasingly harder. Some of you might have experienced that. And I think indies are more likely to make titles for this kind of gamers, the gamers that are valuing their time a little bit more. And so we can advocate for an appreciation of shorter game, be like more meaningful, more dense, intense experiences that are valuing your time more. And what about more extreme demographics? Like Minecraft was tremendously successful with children, right? Nobody was really expecting it. It wasn't necessarily targeted to children, but it became kind of like popular like that. And because it's toy-like, it's sort of like replaced Lego, and it's stylized, not very violent, and somewhat educational, so parents liked it. But what is the youngest demographics you can imagine? How young can be a player? Like, can you make video games for unborn children? Like, can you make video games for fetuses? Because like they move, they react to stimuli. You can track them with ultrasound. You can make a co-op game between mom and a fetus. So what about video games for seniors? The generation born after World War II, the baby boomers, is retiring in droves. This is going to be a major change in how like Western economies work, right? And for game makers, I think this is a major unlocking of free times. You have a lot of people with a lot of free time. So how do you make games that attract people who have never played video games in their whole life? And I think it's a fascinating design challenge because a lot of assumption about what video games are will have to be questioned. Like, for example, the literacy of standard controllers, right? Like the importance of eye-hand coordination. And I think here, too, indies might have an advantage because making games for elders will require rejecting many tropes that dominate AAA games. And it will require experimenting with new genres, devising alternative controllers, which is a thing that artists and game indies do quite a lot, and developing accessible gameplays. And we need to perhaps even mine a different kind of nostalgia, not like the 8-bit nostalgia, but something that goes even back. So my proposal is try to design games with your parents or grandparents. I think some of you might become like the next Minecraft guy. So what about people in prisons? That's a lot of free time. You might need some lobbying to put games into prisons, but what about animals? Like animals play, and pets are always bored, and there's already a little genre of iPad games for pets. Like they are similar to sort of like early games for humans, right? They are based on twitch reaction, eye-hand coordination, but can we push them even further? Can you make like better and more interesting games for humans? Or can we make games that enable a human, non-human kind of play? So this project is called Playing with Pigs, and it's a collaboration between Dutch University and game makers and animal ethicists. So it's kind of an art research project, but why not? Like why can't you have a game with like the pig you're going to eat at the restaurant or something like that? So, plus the European Union in farm animals the European Union requires to have some kind of entertainment for farm animals. Like usually there are ropes that they can chew. Anyway, so like I think there is a market there. So what about video games for plants? So maybe the next frontier is games that don't even need to be played, games that you can watch while doing other things. And I think that's the part of the streaming or let's play explosion. Like people don't have time to play games, but they still want to participate in the culture around it. And so they are kind of just watching them. But what about games played by artificial intelligence? There are artists like Ian Chang that makes self-playing games that are essentially a generative scenario. They are kind of interesting and mesmerizing to watch. Or you might be familiar with the GTA San Andreas Deer Camp, which is a GTA mod in which you are just like following a deer stranded in Los Angeles, basically. Or perhaps the next stage of playing game is not playing game, but making artificial intelligence that play game for us. And that's what like a lot of researchers are already doing, and a lot of game makers are already sort of experimenting. Like you are making your own artificial intelligence, and then you let them play. So my last proposition is even perhaps more fundamental. So we all know that not all is meant to be profitable. So culture has been produced industrially only in the last century or so. And even in the modern era, many works that we consider masterpieces were not even commercially successful. Like many movies that you like were not really like successful at the box office. And I think more importantly, an excess of culture is never really a waste, like an excess of car or fridges or phones. So perhaps the best solution doesn't lie in the relationship between demand and offer, but in liberating games and all culture from the tyranny of the market. So there are like many ways to move in that direction. For example, like public funding for games, considering culture and games as a common good that is meant to be, preserved and encouraged. Or there can be like bottom-top patronage, like Patreon, which allows you to sustain artists that you like beyond the act of selling and buying products. So you're just like investing in one person or one cultural producer, and that's not about one particular project and so on. Or like a universal basic income. Like universal basic income is kind of like an expanded welfare, right? That you get, like, is a way to disentangling income from work time. And it will support an equitable rebalancing of work and leisure time, as I was saying, and also rebalance and redistribute the wealth that is captured by automation and artificial intelligence and so on. And it will allow for more like self-motivated activities. So like if you're getting a universal income, you're not necessarily just like spending time just like smoking pot. You might actually decide to make games, and you might have more support for that kind of games. So it's like you have more time to both produce and consume, and that's a way to decommodify the cultural aspect. So making culture for free and making free culture. So ultimately, if us as a society determine that video games are important and access to culture is a right, then we can allocate resources to support our more or less diffuse production of games. We can do that instead of leaving the production of games and culture to the whims of an inefficient and exclusionary and contradictory market. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. Do we have questions right away? That was a very interesting presentation, especially like some particular slides about new niches for games. I have a question. Just, for example, there is a developer or someone who's going to become a developer, right? And they always have to make a choice what kind of game they are going to make, right? And basically, the choice is either they look at the top charts at the games that are already popular, and they try to do something similar, but then they have risks that nobody's going to play their games, right? Like you mentioned in the beginning. Or, based on your presentation, they can look for something new, an experiment, and maybe find a new way to interact with people, right? Or find a new place where people can play the game, whatever. What would you recommend them? Like, what is less risky, first or second variant?
Like in the past years, when I had people asking me that question, I would be like, oh, go indie, just like start your own thing. And now, like seeing a lot of indies sort of like struggling and making like good stuff, but still like struggling, I'm like, well, you should have to really look deep into you and ask yourself, are you like willing to kind of like put everything on the line and sort of like risk of like really not turning your passion into a full-time job? Maybe it can be a part-time job. Maybe it can be a full-time job for a few full years, but then you sort of start doing something else. And I think that's perhaps like what I would say to my students. And the reason I'm thinking about this stuff, and I don't even sell games commercially, but being a teacher, I teach video games, so I have to think about like the future, essentially, of the industry quite a lot, because I'm committed to my students, essentially.
But then you mean that, in your opinion, in the future, there will be less developers that make super mass market already existing games, and will be more of them that will be exploring and trying to make like the stuff you described. Is that?
I don't know. Yeah, you people decide.
All right. Does anyone want to ask a question?
I mean, yeah, all your points were very good. I understood everything, but shouldn't we focus a bit on the years too? I mean, 2 years before we had the indie year. I mean, lots of indie games and development teams arose. We had, let's say, indie teams like Edmund Macmillan, Rise Up More, Droplock, Dodge Roll, everything. But last year was the year of the franchises mostly. For example, Dark Souls 3. A Darksiders 3 game is coming out. A Borderlands 3 game is coming out. A remastered version of Crash Bandicoot. I mean, last year was a year for mostly franchises and big companies in general. Therefore, most indie development teams didn't have the chance to rise up. But since the next year is way more dangerous for them, since more and more franchises are growing up, what would you recommend for the indie team? Should they wait? Should they promote the subject?
No, like the problem with franchises was one of the things that actually sparked the independent movement as we know it. I mean, like, people have been making games independently since forever, really. But like, when you're hearing like about the indie thing, was mostly a rejection of like franchise, essentially. Like, oh, there are like this all like this 5 intellectual properties that keep being reused, the same sort of like genre. We are tired of it. And even within the game industry, even people who were actually employed and making money in the game industry started to sort of like split up and be like, you know, I'm going to make my own thing. I'm going to just like start my own company. Like, so it was like almost like a movement within the industry against the dominance of franchising and sort of like that kind of like commercial aspect. So like it's not different. Like you might hear sometimes journalists sort of like summarizing a particular year in which there were like some powerful franchise as the year of the franchise, but it's always been like a variety of markets. Yeah.
I'm saying this because 2017 had the chance to promote two great, 4 great indie games, but they got heavily criticized. I mean, it was like a great danger for them. They took the risk, they somehow got rewarded, but they also got a bit punished. For example, Cuphead. It won 2000.
Sorry, what is that?
Cuphead.
Oh yeah.
Cuphead.
But
I mean,
it's
it was
doing
a
well,
revolutionary game, great art style and everything. But game critics started calling about its graphics, about its difficulty. I mean, it was rewarded since it stand out from all the crowd, from the other franchises. But therefore, it got also heavily criticized about every aspect of it. Also, Hollow Knight, for example, about its difficulty, about its repetitiveness after a single point. I mean, indie gamers have a chance to promote themselves, but when they stand out from the crowd, they are risking it.
No, I think you're making a good point. I haven't played Cuphead, but I did read about the kind of like the conversation about it, of like being too hard, being like too stretched out, and that's what when indies are trying to be like to basically sell a game for $20, right? Like they are trying to adapt to the idea that a lot of like PC gamers and people on Steam or PSN is like, oh, if I pay $20, I need a game that lasts like several like hours, like many hours, like say like 10 hours or something like that. And so a lot of indie makers are trying to stretch what the game potential really is, and I have like plenty of examples, or trying to maybe like blow it up, like I don't know, No Man's Sky, that is meant to be a sort of like a big project, but also like an indie project. So like there is that temptation of sort of like over-promising, then that I think it's a danger.
Okay, we have time for the last question.
Well, it's not just a question, it's more like a commentary. When you said that we should pay attention to the rise of the seniors playing the games, I think you're forgetting about the mobile and the whole casual industry. Well, while Indians are still, I mean, they're not able to get into the minds of their parents, but they able to look around and see that the seniors are playing for years to casual games. It's going to be either just hidden object adventure games, or it's going to be social casino genre. Is 55 plus demographics, classic demographics, and then a lot of companies are raising up on these demographics and started to sell their casual match 3 sagas to them, and they spend a lot of time and money in these games.
So yeah, my pitch to indie game makers is like, can this like a sort of like casino games be like the gateway to more interesting games that we get to make? So instead of like treating like older people as a cash cow, as like fools and idiots that just like press a button and you just like take money from them, maybe we can actually that are meaningful for them.
It's a competition. You know, just you will face a fierce competition from the big guys who know how to reward these elders or seniors or whatever beautiful people are who's spending tons of money.
Right.
They just really know how to do that. And indies are still starting their way to know how to make it.
I agree. It's a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to disagree. Like you just named all the like casual games or social casino games that they are like not meaningful or something, and that angry corporations are trying to take money from the elderly. No, that's not true. It's their choice. They actually like those games. I mean, there are people who like meaningful games, and there are people who like play social casino games. And I think the thing that they are actually spending their money, I think it's the best criteria to see which games are interesting or are not interesting. People decide to spend their own money on it. What can be better?
It's a
time, yes.
Culture. It's culturally constructed. It's constructed by discourse. So it's just like I think we can shift the conversation and talk to our grandparents and show them better games that they can actually play instead of giving money to you and you and you. And, like, but that's like my confrontational part, right?
Okay. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation.